They didn't raise their voices when they asked him to leave. They didn't need to. A subtle gesture from a man in a tailored suit was enough. A quiet word from a woman holding a crystal glass sealed it. The old man stood near the edge of the ballroom, surrounded by polished shoes, muted laughter, and the low hum of wealth, pretending not to stare. He listened without interrupting, his posture straight, his hands folded as if this were a request he had rehearsed accepting long ago. Around him, conversation slowed. Not stopped, just slowed enough for judgment to slip in. No one asked what he was doing there. No one asked who invited him. The assumption had already been made, silently and unanimously, that he did not belong. His jacket was clean but worn. His shoes shined, but not new. He looked like a memory that had wandered into the present uninvited. A security guard waited patiently, almost politely, as if embarrassed by the task. The host avoided eye contact. Guests shifted their weight, eager for the moment to pass so the evening could return to comfort. The old man nodded once. No argument, no explanation, no plea. That calm, unsettled more than any protest could have. As he turned toward the exit, a few people exchanged knowing looks, the kind reserved for those who believe they've just witnessed quiet weakness. But one man, standing apart from the crowd, noticed something different. Not the clothes, not the age, the stillness. It wasn't resignation. It wasn't shame. It was restraint. And in that silence, something began to fracture beneath the polished surface of the room, something no one else was prepared to see. If this silence already says something to you, subscribe, because what comes next will say much more. As the old man took his first step away from the lights, the room exhaled in relief. The music seemed louder again. Laughter cautiously resumed. The moment was already being erased. Almost, the man observing from a distance didn't move. He had arrived unnoticed, dressed simply, blending in by design. While others measured worth by appearances, he measured it by reactions, and the reaction he had just witnessed disturbed him deeply. He had seen anger before, desperation, even humiliation masked as politeness, but this was different. The old man walked as someone who had already endured losses far greater than public embarrassment. His face showed no trace of panic, no flicker of wounded pride, only a composed awareness, as if he understood the full weight of what was happening, and still chose dignity over defense. The observer followed him with his eyes, noting details others dismissed. The unhurried pace, the controlled breathing, the absence of bitterness. This was not a man being removed from a place he didn't belong. This was a man choosing not to fight a battle he had already won somewhere else. For the first time that evening, the observer questioned the story everyone else had accepted so as he wondered what kind of past teaches a person to stand so calmly while being quietly erased, and more importantly, what kind of man had the room just decided to humiliate without knowing who he truly was. Because somewhere between the exit doors and the fading music, a truth link unseen that would soon force every person in that room to confront the cost of their certainty. And when it finally surfaced, it would be far too late to pretend this moment had meant nothing. No one in the room could later explain when they first noticed him, only that, somehow, he had been there long enough to become inconvenient. The event unfolded in one of those private venues, designed to feel timeless, where polished wood and soft lighting existed to reassure its guests that nothing unexpected would ever truly happen within those walls. Wealth moved comfortably there, unchallenged and unexamined, wearing subtle confidence instead of display. People spoke in lowered voices, not out of secrecy, but out of certainty that they were among their own. The old man stood near a marble column that reflected the glow of the chandeliers without absorbing any of it. He didn't hover, and he didn't intrude. His presence was quiet, almost careful, as if he understood that space itself was something he was borrowing. He watched more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was only to respond, never to insert himself into conversations that flowed past him like water around a stone. What drew attention wasn't anything he did wrong, it was what he failed to do. He didn't perform familiarity. He didn't exaggerate importance. He didn't try to justify his place there with stories, names, or forced laughter. In a room where identity was currency, he offered none. That absence unsettled people. It left them without a category to place him in, and so they created one instead. Old, outdated, misplaced. Someone noticed the wear on his jacket, not neglect. But time, someone else noticed his hands, steady but marked, the kind shaped by decades of work that left no visible trophies behind. A woman near the bar assumed he was staff, until she realized no one was giving him instructions. A man nearby assumed he was a guest's obligation, brought along out of politeness, and quietly regretted. The judgments didn't announce themselves. They accumulated. Across the room, a man stood alone near the back, holding a glass he hadn't touched. He wasn't dressed poorly, just unremarkably, as if he had intentionally muted every signal that might invite attention. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately, taking in the room the way others took in price tags. He watched patterns instead of people, reactions instead of appearances, and eventually he noticed the old man. At first, it was nothing more than curiosity. The way the old man held himself contradicted the role the room had assigned him. His posture wasn't defensive. His gaze wasn't wondering or uncertain. He seemed grounded, as if he was fully aware of where he stood, and equally aware that it did not define him. The observer noticed something else too, the way others interacted with him. Conversations shortened around him, smiles tightened, eye contact became brief, transactional, polite in the way that kept distance intact. It was a social choreography perfected over years of excluding without confrontation. Still, the old man remained. He accepted a glass of water instead of champagne without comment. He thanked the server, as if gratitude were habit, not strategy. When someone brushed past him too closely, he stepped aside without irritation, without apology. Each small moment carried the same quiet consistency, as though he had long ago learned that dignity was not something granted by rooms like this. The observer felt a faint, unfamiliar tension. Not sympathy, something sharper. A recognition that the room was misreading the situation entirely, and that the old man understood this long before anyone else did. Whatever had brought him there, it wasn't confusion. It was choice. And choices, the observer knew, were rarely made without history. As the evening progressed, and the invisible pressure around the old man tightened, the observer sensed that the room was approaching a decision of its own, one that would reveal far more about those making it than about the man they were quietly preparing to discard. And when that moment arrived, the calm the old man carried so effortlessly would become impossible to ignore. No one yet realized that removing him would not end the story. It would only expose how badly they had misunderstood its beginning. It began the way these things always began in rooms like that, softly, with manners sharpened into weapons. Tehost approached alone. He came with a woman from the organizing committee, and a security guard whose expression suggested he'd been instructed to look respectful, not sympathetic. They moved through the guests in a practice line, smiling at familiar faces, pausing for brief greetings, letting everyone see that they were still in control of the evening even as they prepared to disrupt it. When they reached the old man, the host's smile remained, but had lost its warmth. It became a surface smooth, bright, and empty. "Sir," the host said quietly, as if protecting the old man from embarrassment, "there seems to be a misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding was chosen carefully. It implied innocence. It implied correction. It implied that whatever happened next would be no one's fault, just an unfortunate administrative detail. The old man looked at him with steady eyes, not challenging, not pleading. He didn't ask what kind of misunderstanding could require an audience. He didn't glance around to see who was watching, even though the room had already begun to tilt toward them. It was subtle the way attention rearranged itself. A curtain shifting when someone opens a door. The woman beside the host spoke next, her voice gentle, almost rehearsed. "This is a private event. The guest list is very specific. Very specific." Another careful phrase. Not rude, not direct, just precise enough to signal exclusion while leaving space for denial later. The security guard took one step forward, not threatening, simply ready. His hands rested near his belt, his stance calm, his eyes avoiding the old man's face, as if looking directly might make the job feel personal. A few guests pretended not to notice. Others leaned slightly, as though they could hear better if they angled their body. A man near the bar smirked into his drink, already enjoying the correction of what he considered an obvious mistake. A couple exchanged quick glances. The silent agreement of people relieved that the discomfort they'd felt had been justified. The old man nodded once. "I understand," he said, and his voice carried no bitterness, only clarity. The host blinked, almost thrown off by the lack of resistance. He had prepared for confusion, perhaps indignation. He had prepared for excuses. He had not prepared for acceptance. "There's an exit this way," the woman offered, pointing not with her hand, but with her chin, as if the gesture itself might stain her. Still, the old man did not move immediately. He lowered his gaze briefly, not in shame but in thought, as though measuring something inside himself. Then he looked back up. "May I ask one thing?" he said. The host hesitated. The room tightened. Questions from people being removed were inconvenient. They forced the situation to become real. "Yes," the host said, cautiously. The old man's tone remained calm, almost mild. "Was it ever possible, tonight, for me to belong here in your eyes?" The host's smile faltered. The question landed without aggression, yet it carried the weight of a mirror held too close. For a moment, the host looked exposed, not accused of breaking a rule, but accused of revealing what the rule truly was. He cleared his throat. "This is not personal," he said quickly. "The most common lies spoken in places where everything was personal. We just have standards, expectations, standards, expectations, the vocabulary of polite cruelty." The old man nodded again, as if he'd received an answer he already knew. "I appreciate your honesty," he said, and then he did something that confused nearly everyone watching. He thanked them, not sarcastically, not performatively, a simple, genuine thank you, like a man acknowledging service at a counter. Then he turned toward the exit with the same composed pace he'd held all evening. As he walked, the air behind him loosened, laughter returning in careful increments, conversation restarting as though someone had paused a song. People wanted the moment to dissolve. They wanted the discomfort to fade into the lighting and the music, but the observer near the back didn't look away. He watched the old man's shoulders. No sagging, no frantic tension. He watched the old man's hands steady at his sides, not clenched, not trembling. He watched his face controlled, almost serene, as though humiliation was a weather pattern he'd learned to walk through without getting soaked. And something about it felt wrong. Not wrong like, unfair though. It was unfair in a way the room refused to name. Wrong like incomplete. As the old man neared the doors, the security guard stayed close, still polite, still distant. The host returned to the crowd with relief, already reclaiming his smile, already repairing the evening's image. Guests murmured about how these things happen, about how you can't be too careful, about how it's important to keep things curated. Curated, another word that meant kept clean of people like him. The observer's eyes followed the old man to the threshold, where the bright ballroom light met the darker hallway beyond. For a brief moment, the old man paused and glanced back, not at the host, not at the guests, but at the room itself, as if memorizing it, or forgiving it, or simply acknowledging what it had chosen to be. Then he stepped into the hallway and disappeared from the music. And only then did the observer move. Not quickly, not dramatically, just with purpose, because the observer had seen enough to know that this removal wasn't the end of a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a revelation the room was not ready to face. As the observer followed into the quieter corridor, he noticed something small near the old man's hand, something the crowd would have dismissed as ordinary, but that suggested the old man hadn't arrived by accident at all. The hallway beyond the ballroom was quieter than expected, not empty, but stripped of performance. The music softened into a distant echo, and the polished confidence of the guests gave way to neutral walls and practical lighting. It was the kind of space no one decorated to impress, because no one important was supposed to linger there. The old man walked through it without changing pace. That, more than anything else, unsettled the observer. People who had just been removed politely, or not, usually carried some trace of disruption with them. A tight jaw, a hurried step, a nervous glance over the shoulder, searching for witnesses or validation. Even pride, when wounded, made noise in the body, but the old man moved as if nothing inside him had been disturbed. The security guard slowed once they were out of sight of the guests, giving the old man more space. It wasn't protocol, it was instinct. Something about the man's composure discouraged authority from pressing closer. The guard said nothing. The old man didn't thank him this time, not out of disrespect, but because the interaction no longer required performance. The observer followed at a careful distance, not hiding, not announcing himself. He noticed details now that the ballroom had distracted from before. The old man's breathing was even. His shoulders remained squared, not rigid, just balanced. His gaze stayed forward, not down, not wandering. It was the walk of someone who had made peace with outcomes long before they arrived. They reached a small sitting area near the exit, a place meant for staff breaks or forgotten guests waiting for rides. The old man stopped there, not because he was told to, but because he chose to. He set his jacket neatly over the back of a chair, smoothing at once with his palm, the way someone treats something that still matters. The observer paused nearby, pretending to check his phone, though the screen remained dark. The security guard cleared his throat. "You're free to go, sir," he said, almost apologetically. "I can call a car if you need." The old man smiled, faintly. "That won't be necessary." The guard hesitated, then nodded and walked away, glancing back once as if unsure he was leaving the situation unfinished. Silence settled. The observer expected something, then some release of emotion, some sign that the mask had cracked, now that no one was watching. But the old man only sat down, resting his hands loosely on his knees, his eyes lifting briefly to the ceiling, as if listening to the building breathe. Minutes passed, no sigh, no muttered complaint, no visible resentment. The observer felt a creeping discomfort, the kind that comes when reality refuses to match expectation. He had built empires by understanding people, by knowing what they wanted, feared, and hid. He recognized patterns quickly. This man fit none of them. The old man reached into his pocket and removed a small object, turning it once in his fingers. From a distance, it looked unremarkable. Not jewelry, not a phone. Something worn smooth by time, not by fashion. He studied it briefly, then returned it to his pocket with a care that suggested memory rather than value. That gesture lingered in the observer's mind. Whatever the object was, it mattered. Not as proof, not as leverage, but as a reminder. The old man stood again, adjusting his cuffs, aligning himself before leaving, as though stepping out into the world required the same readiness as stepping into a room like the one he'd just been expelled from. His dignity did not fluctuate with setting. It existed independently. Finally, the observer spoke. "You handled that better than most people would," he said, keeping his tone neutral, almost conversational. The old man turned, surprised but not startled. His eyes met the observer's without calculation, without suspicion. "I've learned," he replied simply. The observer waited, expecting elaboration. It didn't come. "What did you learn?" the observer asked after a moment. The old man considered the question, not defensively, thoughtfully. "That some losses don't require resistance," he said, "and some rooms aren't worth proving yourself in." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Not wisdom delivered for effect, but truth spoken without concern for how it would land. The observer felt something shift, not admiration, something closer to respect, edged with curiosity. Most people spoke like that only after they had nothing left to lose, or after they had already lost everything once and survived. The observer studied the old man more closely now, searching for signs of defeat, of compromise, of bitterness disguised as acceptance. None. Instead, he saw a man who had chosen calm not because he was powerless, but because real power had taught him restraint, and that raised a far more unsettling possibility. What if the calm wasn't the result of being underestimated? What if it was the reason? The observer watched as the old man moved toward the exit doors, pausing only long enough to hold one open for a staff member passing through. A small courtesy, offered without irony, without performance. As the doors closed behind him, the observer remained where he was, suddenly aware that the story unfolding was far larger than a social slight at a private event. Because people who had truly lost everything did not fear humiliation, and people who feared nothing rarely stayed small for long. As the observer prepared to follow him outside, a name surfaced in his memory, one he hadn't heard spoken in years, but that felt uncomfortably close to the man who had just walked away. The night air outside was colder than the ballroom had been, sharper, more honest. It stripped away the artificial warmth and left only what was real. The old man stepped onto the stone walkway and paused, as if orienting himself, not lost, but attentive to the quiet that followed him out. The observer followed a few steps behind, careful now, not because he feared being noticed, but because he sensed he was approaching something fragile, an understanding that could vanish if handled carelessly. For the first time in years, he doubted his initial assessment of a situation. That alone unsettled him. He had built his life on precision, on reading rooms before others realized they were being read, on knowing when power was loud and when it hid behind humility. He rarely misjudged people, and when he did, it was usually because they had gone to great lengths to deceive. This man had done the opposite. The old man walked toward the parking area with unhurried confidence. He didn't check his watch. He didn't search for a ride. He moved like someone who knew exactly how the night would end, even if others didn't. The observer noticed the staff, again the valet, this time hesitate when the old man approached. There was a flicker of uncertainty. People often sensed when someone didn't fit the role they'd been assigned, even if they couldn't explain why. The valet straightened, attentive in a way he hadn't been moments earlier. "Good evening, sir," the valet said, offering a polite nod. "Good evening," the old man replied, returning it with equal respect. No entitlement, no resentment, just balance. The observer stopped a few feet away, pretending again to be occupied with his phone. But his attention was fixed. He replayed the scene in the ballroom, in his mind not the removal itself, but the reactions surrounding it. The host's relief, the guest's justification, the security guard's discomfort, And the old man's calm. It struck him now that the calm had not been passive. It had been deliberate. A choice. The observer realized something else. Something that tightened his chest unexpectedly. The room had not only misjudged the old Manit, had revealed its own insecurity in doing so. Power that needed constant confirmation could not tolerate ambiguity. It needed categories, hierarchies, visible markers. The old man had offered none. That made him dangerous. The observer thought of the object he'd seen briefly in the old man. His hand inside the way it had been handled with familiarity, not pride. He thought of the question the old man had asked the host. Not accusatory, just precise. And he thought of the way the host had faltered, exposed by a single sentence. Slowly, the observer's curiosity transformed into something heavier. Responsibility. Not the kind that came from guilt, but the kind that came from recognition. When you saw something true and chose to ignore it, you became complicit in whatever followed. The old man reached the edge of the parking lot and stopped. A car waited there, already not a luxury vehicle, not something that drew attention, but clean, well-kept, positioned as if it had been expected. The driver stepped out immediately, opening the door without being asked. The observer froze. That wasn't coincidence. He watched the exchange carefully. The driver didn't ask for confirmation, didn't check a name. He greeted the old man with quiet familiarity, like someone who had been waiting, not like someone responding to a last-minute request. The old man nodded once, thanking him softly, then paused before getting in. He turned slightly, his gaze drifting, not searching, just acknowledging the presence behind him. For a brief moment, his eyes met the observer's. There was no surprise in them, only awareness, as if he had known all along that he was being watched. The observer felt something shift again, this time more decisively. The imbalance had reversed. He was no longer the one studying from a position of comfort. He was the one being seen, measured, and silently understood. The old man entered the car, closing the door gently behind him. The vehicle pulled away without urgency, disappearing into the night with the same quiet confidence its passenger carried. The observer remained standing there, the cold now fully settled into his bones. He realized that he had just witnessed a moment most people never recognized when it passed the instant where perception had the chance to change direction, and he had missed it at first. Inside the venue, the event continued. Glasses clinked, deals were hinted at. Comfort returned. No one spoke of the old man again, but the observer could not return to that room unchanged, because he now understood something the others didn't. The old man hadn't been removed because he lacked power. He had been removed because his presence threatened the illusion that power always announced itself. Did they remove a weak man? Or expose themselves? And that meant this story was far from over. As the observer turned back toward the ballroom, he made a decision he rarely made, one that would force him to step out of the shadows and into a role no one there expected. The observer stood for a moment longer in the empty and cold, watching the space where the car had vanished, as if the night itself might offer an explanation. It didn't. Silence rarely did. It only confirmed what had already been decided. When he turned back toward the entrance, he didn't rush. He didn't rehearse a confrontation or imagine the satisfaction of correcting the room. That kind of intervention would have been easy. It would have satisfied instinct. It would have fed the very dynamic he'd spent his life mastering. And that was precisely why he rejected it. Inside, the event resumed its carefully calibrated rhythm. The host laughed a little louder now. The tension had evaporated, replaced by a self-congratulatory calm. People moved on quickly when nothing had been demanded of them. Forgetting was a luxury the room could afford. The observer re-entered unnoticed. Just another face among many. He took his place near the back again. The same unremarkable posture, the same untouched glass in his hand. No one realized that the most powerful man in the room had just decided not to reveal himself. Not yet. He replayed the moment of removal again, but this time he examined his own impulse to act. He had felt it rise quickly, their urge to correct the imbalance, to remind the host and the guests of rules they only followed when convenient. A single word from him would have changed the tone of the night instantly. Names carried weight. Access carried authority, but the old man hadn't asked for rescue. That mattered. Intervening now would have turned dignity into spectacle. It would have reframed the injustice as a misunderstanding resolved by influence, not as a moral failure exposed by choice. The observer understood this instinctively. He had watched too many people accept public vindication only to lose something quieter and more important in the process. Respect earned privately lasted longer, so he chose patience. He listened instead. Around him, conversations revealed themselves without resistance. Guests spoke openly again, confident that the discomfort had passed. Someone joked about the confusion earlier. Another remarked that it was better to be safe than sorry. A third speculated casually about how often people tried to sneak into spaces they didn't belong. The observer felt no anger, only clarity. These weren't cruel people. Not intentionally. They were simply comfortable enough to believe that comfort was proof of correctness. That belief had insulated them from ever questioning how easily they excluded what they didn't understand. The host passed by, still wearing his practiced charm. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met the observer's. He smiled politely, offering a nod of acknowledgement, unaware of how fragile his confidence actually was. The observer returned the nod, and in that exchange, a decision settled fully into place. He would let the night continue exactly as it was. No correction, no announcement, no immediate consequence. Instead, he would allow the truth to surface slowly, in ways that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or personal grievance. He would allow the room to reveal itself further, to speak freely under the assumption that nothing had changed. Because something had not in the room but in him, he realized that power exercised too quickly often dissolved into memory. Power exercised quietly reshaped futures. And the old man, whether he knew it or not, had demonstrated that lesson with devastating precision. The observer began making mental notes, not of faces, but of reactions. Who had watched the removal with discomfort? Who had justified it? Who had enjoyed it? These distinctions mattered. They always did. Time passed. Drinks were refilled. Music softened as the evening leaned toward its intended close. The event would be remembered as successful, efficient, well-managed. That illusion would hold for now. As the observer prepared to leave, he caught a glimpse of the hallway again, empty and unremarkable, already erased from the narrative of the night. He thought of the old man walking through it calmly, caring nothing but his composure and whatever history had taught him restraint. He understood then that interference would have robbed the moment of its meaning. Justice, when rushed, often looked like revenge. Justice, when delayed, looked like inevitability. The observer finished his drink at last, setting the glass down untouched by fingerprints. He adjusted his jacket, blending back into anonymity as he headed for the exit. The night had not ended. It had only been postponed, and when it resumed, it would do so on terms no one in that room had anticipated. As he stepped outside, the observer sent a single, quiet message, one that set into motion a sequence of events that could no longer be reversed. The shift didn't announce itself. It never did. Power rarely arrived with noise when it intended to stay. The days following the event passed quietly, at least on the surface. The host returned to his routines. The venue continued to attract the same familiar names. The guests who had attended that evening spoke of it only in fragments, if at all, already editing the discomfort out of memory. To them, the night had resolved itself neatly. But beneath that calm, something had begun to misalign. It started with small interruptions. Invitations that were usually confirmed within hours lingered unanswered. A sponsor delayed final approval on a partnership that had been considered guaranteed. A board member requested a meeting that had not been scheduled, citing a need for clarification. No accusations, no explanations, just hesitation. The host noticed it first, though he couldn't yet name Italiano. He told himself it was timing, market uncertainty, scheduling conflicts, all the acceptable reasons. Things sometimes slowed down. Still, a faint unease followed him, the kind that didn't respond to logic. Across the city, in a space far removed from chandeliers and curated conversations, the observer sat in a room designed for decisions, not appearances. There were no distractions there, no unnecessary only screens, documents, and the quiet understanding that what happened inside shaped what happened everywhere else. He listened more than he spoke. When his name surfaced in conversations, it was never dramatic. It didn't need to be. Influence, when well established, moved through implication. People adjusted their behavior not because they were told to, but because they sensed alignment shifting. The observer never mentioned the old man. That omission mattered. Instead, he asked questions that seemed unrelated. About values, about criteria, about how organizations defined belonging and risk. Each question was calm, reasonable, difficult to resist, and each one subtly reframed the assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years. The effect was cumulative. At the venue, staff began noticing changes too. Procedures were reviewed. Guest lists scrutinized with a new emphasis on discretion rather than prestige. Security protocols were discussed, not tightened, but someone higher up had expressed concern about optics, though no one could say exactly why. The word circulated quietly. Optics. The host overheard it during a call he hadn't expected to be tense. He laughed it off at first, then stopped when the silence on the other end stretched too long. He realized then that something had shifted beyond his line of sight. For the first time, he felt evaluated, not by his peers but by a standard he hadn't helped define. Meanwhile, the old man continued his life untouched by the tremors he had inadvertently set in motion. He woke early, he kept his routines intact. He spoke little of the evening, because to him, it had already resolved itself, the moment he chose composure over protest. What he didn't know, what he had never needed to know, was that restraint had drawn attention more effectively than outrage ever could. In certain circles, his name resurfaced, not as gossip, as recognition. Fragments of a history emerged, a reputation long assumed dormant. People who had once worked alongside him, learned from him, or been protected by his decisions began connecting dots they hadn't realized were scattered. The power dynamic inverted quietly. Those who had judged him now found themselves uncertain of their footing. Those who had dismissed him as irrelevant felt the subtle discomfort of realizing they had underestimated something enduring. Not wealth, not influence in its loudest form. Character. The observer watched this unfold without interference. He understood now that the reversal was not about punishment, it was about exposure. The room had revealed its priorities, and those priorities were now being measured against a broader, less forgiving lens. In that comparison, status lost its sharp edges. The host began to sense it most acutely when an invitation arrived, not an offer but a request, one that framed participation as conditional rather than assumed. He read it twice, unsettled by the tone. It was polite, professional, non committo. For the first time, he wondered if the man he had removed so efficiently had left behind more than a brief disruption. He wondered if that calm acceptance had been something else entirely. At this, and whether he had failed it without realizing there had been one. As the lines of influence continued to blur, a single detail from the old man's past resurfaced, one that would soon make denial impossible. The first fragment surfaced quietly, the way truth often did when it no longer needed permission. It appeared in a conversation that wasn't meant to be consequential to professionals reviewing past partnerships, tracing the origins of a decision that had once been considered foundational. A name emerged, spoken cautiously at first, then repeated with growing certainty. It wasn't a common name, but it carried a familiarity that unsettled the room. Someone paused, someone else leaned forward, and suddenly, a memory took shape. Years ago, long enough to be half forgotten, recent enough to still matter, there had been a man who moved differently through corridors of influence. He hadn't chased visibility. He hadn't attached his identity to titles or applause. He had been present where it mattered most, absent where ego demanded display. Decisions had followed him, even when he wasn't credited for them. The fragment expanded. Someone remembered a crisis narrowly avoided. Another recalled a moment when an entire operation had been rerouted based on advice that came from a man who'd never raised his voice. A third remembered how credit had been redirected upward, while real responsibilities had been carried quietly by someone else. The pattern felt familiar now, across different rooms, among people who had never compared notes before. The same realization formed independently. The old man hadn't disappeared from relevance. He had stepped away from recognition. The observer listened as these fragments accumulated. He never corrected, never accelerated the process. He understood that partial truths, when discovered organically, were far more destabilizing than full revelations delivered too quickly. What emerged wasn't a dramatic backstory. There were no scandals, no heroic monologues, just consistency, judgment exercised without spectacle, influence applied without signature. The kind of past that didn't announce itself but endured. Meanwhile, the host began hearing the name too. At first, indirectly, a hesitation when he mentioned certain affiliations, a subtle shift in tone during conversations that had once been easy. He asked questions casually, careful not to expose his growing unease. The answers unsettled him. He learned that the old man had once been central to institutions the host now relied on for credibility, that his absence from public view hadn't been due to failure, but to a decision one made after loss, disillusionment, or perhaps clarity. No one agreed on the reason, only on the result. The man had walked away, and in doing so, he had allowed others to rise into positions they now defended fiercely. The host replayed the evening again in his mind, but this time the details felt different. The worn jacket no longer suggested decline. It suggested longevity. The calm no longer looked like resignation. It looked like experience. Even the question, was it ever possible, tonight, for me to belong here in your eyes, took on a sharper edge in retrospect. It hadn't been a plea. It had been a measurement. The observer recognized the danger of what was unfolding, not for the old man, but for those who had assumed irrelevance where there had only been withdrawal. Partial revelations created tension. They forced reassessment without offering closure. They made people uncomfortable without telling them how to resolve that discomfort. That was the point. Because the truth, when it came, would not be kind to certainty built on appearance. Some details remained elusive. The full scope of the old man's influence wasn't yet visible. There were gaps in the timeline. Years unaccounted for. Decisions attributed to committees that no longer existed. The story resisted simplification, and that resistance made it credible. The old man, unaware of these conversations, continued living without adjustment. He met an old colleague for coffee without ceremony. He declined invitations that hinted at renewed relevance. He carried himself with the same restraint that had defined him long before the ballroom incident. He did not seek correction. He did not demand recognition, which only deepened the impact of what was being rediscovered. Because people who chased validation eventually exposed themselves. People who no longer needed it made others question why. The observer understood now that the past was surfacing not to redeem the old man but to confront everyone else with the cost of their assumptions. And still, the most important truth remained hidden. The reason behind the calm, the reason behind the withdrawal, the reason why humiliation had failed to touch him, those answers waited, intact, beyond the fragments. As more pieces of the past aligned, one final question began to circulate. What had the old man lost that made dignity his only non-negotiable possession? The truth did not arrive as an announcement. It never did. It surfaced the way deep things always surfaced, through necessity. The observer learned it not from records or conversations, but from a moment of quiet convergence. A request, modestly framed, reached him through channels that no longer required explanation. Someone wanted perspective, not leverage, not endorsement. Perspective. It was the kind of request only made when certainty had failed. The observer agreed to meet, not in an office or a boardroom, but in a place stripped of pretense, no agendas. Just two people and the weight of what had been misunderstood. The old man arrived first. There was no tension between them now, only recognition. The old man did not ask why the observer had followed him that night, or why things had shifted afterward. He understood causality without needing it outlined. When you lived long enough, patterns explained themselves. They spoke of ordinary things at first. Weather, time, the city's habit of reinventing itself, while forgetting who had built it. Silence filled the spaces between sentences without discomfort. Eventually, the observer asked the question that had lingered since the ballroom. "You didn't fight it," he said. "You didn't even hesitate." "Why?" The old man didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window, not searching for words, but measuring whether they were necessary. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, unburdened by drama. "Because once," he said, "I fought something that mattered, and I lost." The observer waited. The old man continued, not chronologically, not defensively, just truthfully. There had been a time when status meant something to him, when recognition felt earned, even deserved, when rooms like that ballroom had welcomed him not for what he wore, but for what he carried into them. He had believed that influence could be exercised responsibly, that systems could be steered gently toward fairness. Then came the loss. Not financial, not reputational. Personal. The kind of loss that didn't leave visible scars, but restructured everything underneath. A family fractured by decisions that had seemed necessary at the time. A moment when being right had cost more than being wrong ever could. The kind of grief that rewired priorities permanently. "I learned," the old man said quietly, "that dignity is the last thing you own when everything else is negotiable." After that, he stepped back. Not out of fear, out of clarity. He chose obscurity because it allowed him to live without compromising what remained. He let others take credit because credit was lighter to carry than regret. He walked away from rooms that demanded performance because he no longer needed permission to exist. "And when they asked you to leave?" the observer asked. The old man smiled faintly. "That wasn't loss," he said. "That was confirmation. Confirmation that he had already survived worse, that humiliation only held power over those who still needed approval to feel whole. That calm wasn't submission, it was memory." The observer understood then what no one in the ballroom could have grasped. The old man hadn't stayed calm because he was powerless. He stayed calm because he had already paid the highest price life could demand and had chosen to keep his integrity intact afterward. Everything else was negotiable. Silence settled again, heavier now, but cleaner. The observer felt something he hadn't felt in years. Certainty without arrogance. He realized that the injustice at the event hadn't wounded the old man at all. It had merely revealed a room unprepared to recognize a different kind of strength. And that strength did not need to announce itself. It waited. With the truth finally clear, The observer faced a final choice, whether to let the lesson remain personal, or allow it to reshape the room that had failed to see it. The observer did not act immediately. That restraint was deliberate. Justice, he knew now, did not need to arrive as correction. It needed to arrive as understanding inescapable, self-inflicted, and irreversible. Anything louder would only give people a way to defend themselves, instead of confronting what they had revealed. So the response unfolded the same way the injustice had. Quietly, the venue did not receive accusations. It received distance. Invitations that once guaranteed attendance were declined without explanation. Partnerships that relied on unspoken approval found themselves paused, not rejected, simply. Unanswered influence did not push back. It stepped away. An absence, when expected presence had long been taken for granted, spoke louder than outrage ever could. The host noticed it fully only when a long-planned expansion stalled. No objections were raised. No criticisms offered. Just a careful suggestion that alignment might need to be reassessed. The words were polite, professional, devastating. He revisited the guest list from that night, more than once, searching for a mistake he could correct. There was none. The error had not been procedural, it had been perceptual. Slowly, inevitably, the realization settled in. The man he had removed had not been an outsider who slipped in. He had been a standard the room no longer recognized. By the time the truth became undeniable, it was too late to undo the moment. Apologies would have required humility the room had not practiced. Explanations would have sounded like excuses. Silence, now, was the only honest response left. The old man never returned. He did not seek acknowledgement. He did not accept belated invitations framed as reconciliation. His life did not require validation from places that measured worth so poorly. He continued forward with the same calm that had unsettled the room and changed, unburdened. In time, the story of that evening faded into something else. Not gossip, not scandal, a reference. People spoke of it obliquely, as a reminder. A caution, a moment when assumptions had been exposed without a single raised voice. When dignity had outlasted status. The observer watched this transformation from a distance, satisfied not by outcome, but by alignment. The lesson had not been enforced. It had been absorbed, and that was the only kind that endured. Years later, when new faces filled similar rooms and confidence again mistook itself for virtue, the observer would sometimes recall the old man standing calmly near the marble column, the stillness, the restraint, the quiet refusal to beg for belonging. True power did not demand recognition. True power did not need to stay. It walked Hawaii, carrying its dignity intact, and allowed the world to feel the weight of what it had failed to see. And those who remembered the moment truly remembered it never judged silence the same way again, because they had learned, too late, but not in vain, that the calmest person in the room was often the one who had already survived the worst, and that injustice, when met with dignity, eventually revealed itself to be nothing more than ignorance exposed by time. If this story made you see power differently, leave a like and subscribe for more stories that don't announce themselves.